Hello, everybody, again, and welcome to the 20th ReCap webinar. Today's webinar is entitled The International Dimension of Russia's Crony Capitalism. Our speaker is Anders Aslund, a senior fellow at Stockholm Free World Forum and an adjunct professor at Georgetown University. Anders formerly was a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council and the chairman of the International Advisory Council at the Center for Social and Economic Research. He also worked at the Peterson Institute for International Economics. Anders' work focuses on economic transition from centrally planned to market economies. He served as an economic advisor to the governments of Kyrgyzstan, Russia, and Ukraine, and acted as director of the Russian and Eurasian program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Anders was an advocate of early comprehensive and radical economic reforms in Russia and Eastern Europe. Is one of the world's leading experts on the collapse of the planned Soviet economy. Today's webinar draws from his recent book entitled Russia's Crony Capitalism, The Path from Market Economy to Kleptocracy, published by Yale University Press in 2019. Anders will tell us about Russia's offshore wealth, currently estimated at $1 trillion, roughly 2/3 of Russia's annual GDP. This wealth is kept in anonymous companies, largely invested in the United States and the United Kingdom. This money is kept abroad because it is not safe in Russia, as it can be confiscated. It is not productive and it is not taxed by anybody. It poses major political dangers, as it can buy the politics in any country. The necessary cure is complete transparency of global finances and severe penalties against the financial crimes committed. The current freezing of oligarch assets may be an important step to promote global democracy and greater equity. Without further ado, Anders, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Claudio. And it's nice to be in contact with you all. Let me show you my book, Russia's Crony Capitalism, The Path from Market Economy to Kleptocracy. It was published 3 years ago, but it turns out that it has attracted more interest now, because what I present of Putin's Russia is a pretty dark picture. When it was published, people said, but it's not as bad as that. Now people say, yes, this is how bad it is. But let me draw it out a bit more broadly and then come back to Russia. The big question that Claudio has posed in the seminar is what is the problem with capitalism today, and how can we reform capitalism to make it sustainable? You can put it in brief terms that the problem is excessive income and wealth inequality. And in the US and emerging economies, we are seeing a decline in public service sectors and also a decline of competition, because the feature that is most typical of this situation is that the billionaires, the winners, take all. As Claudio already mentioned, they don't pay taxes. This is done sometimes illegally, sometimes illegally. They buy the politics and they buy the courts. And Gabriel Zucman, whose work I'm very much relying upon, puts 10% of global financial wealth in offshore havens, where it's completely untaxed. And the fundamental problem that I would like to discuss with you today, it is dark money. And this is the offshore. Russia is very prominent in this world. The common estimate of Russian offshore financial wealth is $1 trillion. This is relatively easy to arrive at from net capital outflow from Russia from around 1990. So the funny thing is that Russia has had good statistics and record how the money is going out. What is not done at all is seeing where the money is going, because it's then going to offshore havens. The typical way for Russian money to go out traditionally has been through Cyprus, onto British Virgin Islands, onto Cayman Islands, and then to two places, either to Wilmington, Delaware, or to London. There are many varieties of this road. Typically, a cloud of Russian offshore companies of really dirty money is layered with 20 to 30 layers of shell companies, and they are in a dozen different jurisdictions. It means that it's prohibitively expensive to try to trace all these companies if you don't get it served on a plate. So therefore, this is virtually never done. The intention is to make it so complex so that you can't find it. And the problem is that all of these jurisdictions are offering anonymous companies. What do you want when you want to hide money? You want three things. Well, first of all, you want rule of law. That is, you don't want to keep the money in Russia. That's the original reason for moving the money out of Russia. It can be that the rule of law is not existing, which has been the case pretty much all the time. And it can be that the banks are not safe enough in order to keep significant amounts of cash. But anyhow, whatever, or it might be that the source is a criminal, but I think that's less of an issue. And of course, you want to avoid taxes. But the fundamental reason is you don't have rule of law, you don't have property rights in Russia, so you need to move the money out. And for that purpose, basically all Western jurisdictions are good enough, plus British overseas territories and many former British overseas territories that have become independent but maintain a good rule of law. And the second thing you want as a Russian oligarch, that is that you can hide the money. That the money is anonymous is very important. And the third thing is you want deep financial markets. And then all of a sudden, the world is being reduced to two countries, the United States and the United Kingdom. These are the two huge offshore havens. Often a lot of different offshore havens are being discussed. For example, Luxembourg, Switzerland, the Netherlands on the European continent. But as Gabriel Zucman has very well clarified, mostly these are connected. These offshore havens are rarely competitors. They are rather complements. You want to have your money in many offshore havens so that they can't be traced. And the different offshore havens are specializing in different services. So they hang together rather than being competitors. And why did this arise? You can say that there were a combination of two big factors. One was the UK big bang of 1986, when the British government allowed a far-reaching liberalization of all kinds of financial services. Economically, this was a great success, but it also meant that the whole Caribbean boom started, the financial boom, that you could transfer money to all kinds of places in the Caribbean. And this was the pull factor. But you also had the push factor, and that was the collapse of the Soviet Union I mentioned $1 trillion of Russian money, but we also have probably a few $100 million of other former Soviet republic countries, particularly Ukraine and Kazakhstan. So that provided a push. That was, they all had a need for safety. But what is important to notice is that this is nothing old. It's nothing that has been forever, as people often think. This is essentially a phenomenon that has lasted 30, 35 years, and it is time to change it. The offshore money has many effects, both in Russia and abroad. In Russia, it means that the oligarchs, and for that matter, government officials, have the money safely abroad. This means that they have no desire to reform Russia, because they are benefiting from the poor rule of law in Russia. This means that they can move on other owners of money in Russia. They can, corporate trading is widespread in Russia. Corporate trading in Russia does not mean what it means in the West. It means that somebody who's powerful, could be a government official, could be a big businessman, seizes other companies, and he or she uses courts and other government authorities in order to get this. Bill Browder has discussed how this is going on to take $250 million in tax returns from the Russian state. And that was how his accountant, Sergei Magnitsky, died in a Russian prison more than a decade ago. And the reason why he died, it was that he was revealing this scheme where officials in various government institutions, prosecutors, police, and tax officials and lawyers, how they had robbed the state. And the interesting thing is that the money went higher up than ever understood. So in the Panama Papers, it was then revealed that $800,000 of this money had gone to President Putin himself. So what we have here is a full-fledged system of criminal attachment, where the government is cooperating in it, and the government officials are stealing from the government themselves. And this goes all the way up to the president. And this is a sign of how insidious and harmful the offshore is. And at the same time as the Russian oligarchs did not want the rule of law at home, they benefited from the rule of law abroad. So why should they push for any reforms? If they lose out in Russia, as is often the case, they immigrate to London, the French Riviera, or to Dubai, or also often to Israel. So there are places where they are welcome and where they can benefit from a strong rule of law. And what they have done previously doesn't really matter. The amounts of money are quite big. We are talking about $1 trillion of Russian financial assets. The reason why it's not more, it is that the assumption is that there is no return of the money, because the main aim of the owners is to protect the money so that it's being safe. It might be too conservative an assessment, but it's quite likely. And some part of this money, a big part, goes to Cayman Islands. And Cayman Island is considered a squeaky clean constituency, jurisdiction for no good reason. Cayman Island investment in US securities, according to the US Treasury, has now reached $2.5 trillion. My assessment would be that about, or guess I should say, is that about $500 billion of this money is Russian, and probably $200 billion or so should be subject to sanctions. In fact, Cayman Islands recently announced proudly that they had frozen $7 trillion of suspect Russian assets, and that is just a small fraction of the likely amount. So this is big money, and the US Treasury has no idea, because all of this money is anonymous, and it's hidden extremely well. So the conclusion here is that the billionaires have bought both politics and the economy. And this is, of course, particularly striking in a country like Russia, but we see it's also true in the United States, that competition has declined. The big companies can refuse to obey government regulation, and they are being supported in this by US protectionists, which means that they are not being exposed to competition. And as the billionaires have bought the states, democracy has declined since 2006, according to Freedom House. So my idea is very much that financial secrecy, the offshore havens, are undermining our democracy and our economies, and also public services, of course. So this is a profound and serious deterioration of capitalism that we are seeing. What can be done about this? My short answer is transparency, transparency, transparency. So it needs to be legalized, and it needs to be fully implemented. Fortunately, now we are seeing a lot of things that are being done in this direction, but of course, too little and too slowly. One alternative here is anti-money laundering legislation and corporate transparency law. And another is bank regulation. Know your customer. I've seen some of these clouds of offshore companies, which comes from banks, because the banks do want to know whom are they actually lending money to. And if they don't know who the ultimate beneficial owners are, then they can't know. And there are also indirect means. The US has something called geographic target orders, which means that the title companies that are registering real estate deals, they have to know who is the ultimate beneficial owner, otherwise no deal can be made. This has been introduced in the most corrupt parts of the United States, New York, Florida, California, and recently also in Washington, DC, and in its suburbs. So there are many ways of getting at it, and the problem is to implement it. You also often hear that transparency doesn't really work, that it's very difficult to maintain it. I'm Swedish myself. And Sweden, and then together with Finland, introduced the first Public Information Act in the world in 1766. It was when Sweden had a lively parliament that where the low-class party wanted to expose aristocrats, and the best way of doing so was to force them to reveal everything. So Sweden has since then had the rule that everything is public that does not touch upon medical issues and national security. And this has lasted all along. Amazingly, Finland maintained full transparency while being part of a Russian empire for slightly more than a century, which shows that transparency can hold in all kinds of situations. Denmark and Norway introduced the same kind of public information legislation 5 years later in 1771, and it has also held in these countries. Sadly, it's only one country that has introduced such transparency later on, and that's Estonia after it became independent again in 1991. And now you can see that these 5 countries, they are all the time among the top countries when it comes to Transparency International Corruption Perception Index, that is having least corruption, and also in the press freedom report by the reporters without borders. So press freedom, democracy, and transparency go together. You could also find other correlations with, for example, strong public services and comparative equality. So democracy is very much dependent on transparency, and this is a reason why it should be available. All personal financial information is public in these 5 countries, and all registries and tax returns are public. In Norway, all tax returns are available on the web. An argument you're hearing is that this would be dangerous if all this information was available for old widows who would be afraid of their security. Well, the Nordic countries have very low crime rates. So there are other matters that are far more important for crime rates than this kind of information. And we should put democracy and the functioning of society or of capitalism as the top issues, and they are really information problems. And this is the big thing I want to tell you today. Transparency is the basis of successful democracy and of successful capitalism. Without a far-reaching transparency, we can't receive it. So let me then, as a third part of this talk, turn to what is being done today. And this really falls into 2 different parts. One is transparency legislation in the West, and another is what is happening with the Russian sanctions right now. The European Union has been going ahead slowly but steadily in this area. In June 2018, the European Union adopted its 5th anti-money laundering directive. And that is really a path-breaking directive. You know, with an EU directive first, each country should adopt legislation within 2 years, and then they should implement it. And sometimes countries don't adopt the legislation in time, and they don't implement in time. But this is now going on. The big news from the Fifth Anti-Money Laundering Directive was that each country had to establish a public registry of all the significant ultimate beneficial owners of significant assets. And this is now proceeding. Fortunately, there are NGOs like Transparency International that are checking countries that are not moving fast enough. You might not be surprised to hear that Luxembourg is lagging seriously behind as one of the main offshore havens in Europe. Also Britain, which was then still part of the European Union, adopted it, and it forced the British overseas territories to do so as well, but it has not been implemented. It is moving, but slowly. Fortunately, we are now seeing a domestic rage in Britain against all of the oligarch properties. And I think that this is very useful because this is what should be done. In the United States, I think this is the most difficult situation, because here we have millions of anonymous LLCs. But in January 2021, the US Congress adopted the Corporate Transparency Act of 2020, which is not going as far as the EU legislation, but it requires that FinCEN, the financial police of the US Treasury, within 1 year should establish a registry for the ultimate beneficial owners. This would not be public, but it would be available to all law enforcement and to financial institutions. The coverage here is much less. Not surprisingly, the FinCEN has not set up the rules for it as yet, so it's seriously delayed. The legislation, as is usually the case, contains rather vague, ambiguous terms like LLCs and similar entities. What are similar entities? There are very many different legal forms in the United States. So this is a big issue, how broad the coverage can be. As you can imagine, on the one hand, we have NGOs, transparency NGOs that are pushing for strict rules, while there are lots of not so apparent corporate lobbyists who are working for this being as non-transparent as possible. The two worst lobbies here are the lawyers themselves and the real estate lobby. But this is an ongoing struggle, and we'll see where it ends up. On then to the Russia sanctions. My hope is that the current Western sanctions on Russian oligarchs will be turning things around, because there are many indirect effects of these sanctions. As I already mentioned, I think that the amount of assets that should be sanctioned legally are about $400 billion. $50 billion or so of assets have actually, oligarch assets, have actually been frozen. It's unclear in Belgium if the Euroclear is properly frozen. That would be $100 billion more of assets. That's $150 billion of assets. When people see these assets, they say, why do these belong to these people? Does this make any sense? And President Biden and a couple of US congressmen, Tom Malinowski of the Democrats and Joe Wilson of the Republicans, have introduced legislation to confiscate the frozen assets that have been frozen on the basis of Russia sanctions. And of course, one has to look more in details what people have done, but this makes a lot of sense to me. If you think of it, this money is hidden offshore. It does not provide any investment anywhere. In the former Soviet Union, investment, particularly in Russia and Ukraine, have been very low, at 20% of GDP or less, because the money is offshore. And the oligarchs don't dare or want to invest in their own countries. So why do they have the money? What they indulge in is conspicuous consumption of the kind that Torsten Veblen taught us about the robber barons in the United States. And I'll give you a bit of details how it functions. In order to be an oligarch, you have to have three things. You need to have palaces, plural. You need to have at least one super yacht, and you need to have private jets. So let me take what it looks like. It's a clear order of ranking. You need to be at the top, otherwise you are nobody. So who has the biggest palace? Of course, Putin, which costs more than $1 billion on the Black Sea. Of course, he doesn't recognize that it's his palace, but it is. And other big oligarchs, the heads of Gazprom and Rosneft, state companies, but who cares that they are state companies? They have built palaces outside of Moscow for $300 and $400 million. And then we have the run of the Russian oligarchs who are billionaires. They have palaces for about $100 million, and they are in London, on the French Riviera, and or in Monaco. Capria is particularly popular among the Russian oligarchs just beside Monaco, or around Moscow, so, and preferably in all three places. You need to have a few different places, and you can also have a few in the United States. So, for example, Roman Abramovich, real estate in New York for $120 million, and a house in Aspen, Colorado for $50 million. Then you need to have a yacht, and there are about 180 to 200 Russian super yachts. The biggest, surprise, surprise, belongs to Putin, now frozen in Italy, apparently costing $700 million. Of course, it's not established that it actually belongs to Putin, but we may assume that it does so. 2 weeks before Putin started his war against Ukraine, he moved his smaller yacht, Graceful, only worth about $100 million, from Hamburg to Kaliningrad, so that he would have one super yacht available if the Western countries would freeze the yachts. Nobody else moved the yachts, to my knowledge, at that time, showing that Putin had prior knowledge. The other big oligarchs, Roman Abramovich, Alisher Usmanov, Andrei Milichenko, people with assessed ownership of about $20 billion each, they have smaller yachts. You must not have a yacht that is bigger than Putin's, of about $600 million. Then other important oligarchs have yachts for, like Gennady Timchenko, for $300 million. And then again, we have run-of-the-mill Russian billionaires who have yachts for about $100 million. So this is just like Torsten Veblen taught us about conspicuous consumption. Then you need to have private jets. Roman Abramovich, who excels in this world, he has one 787, Boeing 787 now, and previously had a Boeing 767. So that you need to have a big plane showing who you are. And so on, the same with watches. This is conspicuous consumption of the worst type. It shows that these people don't know what to do with their money. They are giving a little bit for charitable purposes, but primarily to help themselves staying, getting citizenships in suitable countries or staying out of sanctions. And therefore, it's very difficult to defend this kind of property that is not being used for any good purpose. And it's difficult to see that this should be given full sanctity of private property rights. Add to this that they have benefited from not paying taxes ever on this money, and they have not, they have suppressed competition within Russia and sometimes also abroad. So this seems very dubious property indeed, and at least not full property right should be applied. We can discuss if it should be taken over altogether, or if that should be handled differently. And then to conclude, I would say that I think that this is the an interesting beginning of something different. The offshore must not persist. The offshore is an abomination to democracy and also to the market economy. The money in the offshores is not taxed. When it is being invested anywhere, it is unfair competition because of not having been taxed. And I think that we should call for an end of the offshore altogether. I think that this is perfectly possible. Most of the offshores have ended. If you look around the Caribbean, well, Bermuda is not Caribbean, but it has been very strictly restricted what it does. The same is actually true for Bahamas also. So these are not the general offshore havens. The two big offshore havens is British Virgin Islands, but that's only company formation, and that is being squeezed now. But British Virgin Islands has assets of $1.5 trillion registered in on a very small territory with tens of thousands of people. And the West is, of course, Cayman Islands with many $trillions of assets and 60,000 people. Last I checked, there were 158 banks in Cayman Islands. And this is a British territory, as is the British Virgin Islands. These are things that the UK Parliament can clean up if it wants to do so. Many of the other territories have lost out. Turks and Caicos and Anguilla, which are British territories, and Antigua, and most of the other islands had financial crisis, with a global financial crisis in 2008 to 2010. And if you have had a financial crisis, you're out. The same was true of Cyprus in 2013. Cyprus has now substantially cleaned up their act. The European countries have been quite transparent for a long time. I would here particularly praise Italy for being the first that froze assets belonging to Putin's crony Arkady Rotenberg. And the exceptions in Europe, on the European continent, are really three: Switzerland, of course, Luxembourg, most of all, and the Netherlands. And then we have relatively few countries that are big problems today. I would say that the United States is by far the biggest problem. And this is also that the black money is big in US elections. So here you come with a Russian company with 30 shell companies on top of each other. And this company gives millions of dollars to a so-called super PAC. And that is legal because nobody knows where it is. It would have been illegal if they knew that the money comes from Russia, but they do. So nobody says anything about it. There are tens of millions of dollars of black money on both sides in the US elections now. And this is an abomination that should end. The second country is the UK. I already talked about Cayman Islands. And then we have Dubai. Dubai is now the big black hole where all Russian oligarchs that can't go anywhere else are flocking. And this is not likely to hold. In February, the Financial Action Task Force at the OECD deemed that Dubai is a dark money place. So it's put on FATF's a gray list. And I think that this will put Dubai under substantial pressure. But when the US and the UK treasuries get into action, they can do a lot. As we saw when the US Treasury opened up Switzerland from its old bank secrecy in 2011, because it had got UBS illegal tax evasion accounts in the thousands, and Switzerland gave up then. I don't think that Dubai will hold out. There are other places. Singapore could be mentioned, which is a well-respected place for anonymous money. But I think that most of these places will think again when they see the pressure from the US and UK treasuries. Thank you very much. I would like to end there and happy to hear your questions and comments.